At 1:23 in the morning on April 26, 1986, reactor number 4 at the Vladimir Ilyich Lenin nuclear power station near Pripyat, Ukraine, produced a steam explosion so powerful that it blew the 1,000-ton steel and concrete lid clean off the reactor core. The graphite moderator caught fire. The temperature at the core's heart reached an estimated 2,000 degrees Celsius. And in the next 14 seconds, more radioactive material was released into the atmosphere than all nuclear weapons tests ever conducted combined. Somewhere between 400 and 500 times the radiation released at Hiroshima. Not over years, not over months, 14 seconds. Think about that. The wind was blowing northwest that night, toward Belarus, toward Poland, toward eventually the entirety of continental Europe. And the Soviet Union, MRL, for 36 hours, said nothing, told no one. The 50,000 people living in Pripyat weren't evacuated until an entire day and a half had passed, by which time every single one of them had been exposed to radiation levels that, as epidemiologist Mikhail Malko documented in research published through the Belarusian Academy of Sciences, would track through their biology and their children's biology for generations. That is what actually happened. And now I want you to hold all of that, the heat, the silence, the 36 hours of nothing, and ask a different question entirely. What if it had happened here? What if the reactor that ruptured wasn't in Soviet Ukraine, but inside the United States of America? What if the graphite burned not above the Pripyat marshes, but above one of the most densely populated, politically charged, technologically interconnected societies on Earth? Because here's the thing. The United States in 1986 was operating 100 commercial nuclear reactors. 100! Scattered from the coast of Maine to the California shoreline. And the question of whether American nuclear infrastructure was meaningfully safer than Soviet infrastructure is, when you actually look at the engineering record and the regulatory history, a far more uncomfortable question than most people want to sit with. Let's do this properly. Let's follow the evidence. Because the implications, and I cannot stress this enough, get larger the further in you go, not smaller. Start with the physics. American light water reactors, the standard design used across virtually all U.S. commercial plants in 1986, used water both as coolant and as moderator, meaning that if the coolant was lost, the chain reaction slowed and stopped. The Soviet RBMK reactor design that failed at Chernobyl used graphite as the moderator and water only as coolant, meaning that if the coolant boiled away, the reaction actually accelerated. That design flaw, what nuclear engineers call a positive void coefficient, is what turned a safety test at Chernobyl into a catastrophe. American reactors didn't have that specific vulnerability. But, and this is the part that gets me every single time, that does not mean they were safe. The partial meltdown at 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania had occurred just 7 years earlier in 1979. Nuclear engineer Charles Perrow, in his landmark 1984 study, Normal Accidents, published by Princeton University Press, argued with devastating precision that in any sufficiently complex, tightly coupled system, serious accidents are not anomalies. They are statistical inevitabilities. And in 1986, American reactors were complex, tightly coupled, and, as the Nuclear Regulatory Commission's own internal reports from that period acknowledge, subject to significant human error risk, aging infrastructure, and inconsistent safety culture across different operators. So imagine, for the purposes of this exercise, a scenario that the historical and engineering record suggests was not fantastical. A loss of coolant accident at a reactor like Indian Point, which sat 35 miles north of Midtown Manhattan and served as the power source for the New York metropolitan area. Or at the Pilgrim Nuclear Generating Station on the coast of Massachusetts. Or at the Dresden Generating Station in Illinois, 45 miles southwest of Chicago. Any of these. Pick one. Because what follows? And this is where the exercise stops being hypothetical and starts being genuinely terrifying. is where the physics of identical nuclear failure diverges completely from the Soviet experience. Not because the radiation would be different, but because everything surrounding the reactor would be different in ways that would reshape the next 40 years of human history. The immediate response would have been incomparably faster and incomparably more visible. Right. This is the first divergence that matters because it cascades through everything that follows. The Soviet government's 36-hour silence wasn't bureaucratic incompetence. It was institutional reflex, the product of a system where acknowledging catastrophic failure was itself a form of political suicide. American emergency management infrastructure in 1986, while imperfect, and the response to 3 Mile Island had exposed serious coordination failures, as documented in the Kemeny Commission report commissioned by President Carter, was nonetheless operating in a media environment that the Soviet system simply did not have to contend with. There were local television stations. There were investigative journalists. There were independent regulatory bodies with subpoena power. A reactor explosion 35 miles from New York City would have been on every television screen in America within 20 minutes. Not 36 hours, 20 minutes. And here's where it gets strange. That speed, that immediate, unavoidable transparency, would have triggered a political and social cascade for which there is genuinely no historical precedent in American life. Historian J. Samuel Walker, in his authoritative study, 3 Mile Island, A Nuclear Crisis in Historical Perspective, published by the University of California Press, documents how even the relatively contained TMI accident in 1979 produced a 70% collapse in public support for nuclear energy within weeks and contributed directly to the de facto moratorium on new nuclear plant construction that lasted until the 2000s. Now scale that response. Take a full core rupture. Take visible radiation plumes tracked in real time on satellite. Take the mandatory evacuation of an area containing, depending on the specific reactor, anywhere from 3 to 12 million people. Not 50,000. Not the population of a mid-sized Ukrainian city. Millions of people moving away from a contaminated zone in a society with 24-hour news coverage, a free press, and a legal system that allowed class-action tort litigation. The evacuation alone would have been unlike anything ever attempted in American history. Federal Emergency Management Agency planning documents from the mid-1980s, declassified and studied by political scientist Lee Clark in his book Mission Improbable, show that American emergency planners privately acknowledged they had no realistic plan for evacuating major metropolitan areas in the event of a nuclear accident. The plans that existed were, as Clark puts it with remarkable precision, fantasy documents, designed to create the appearance of preparedness rather than actual preparedness. The traffic alone. Think about that. The interstate highway system in the New York area moves roughly 400,000 vehicles per day under normal conditions. A mandatory evacuation order for a 30-mile radius would put somewhere between 4 and 6 million people in their cars simultaneously. The modeling for how long that would take, published in the journal Risk Analysis by researchers Timothy Swartz and James Flynn, suggested a minimum of 72 hours to clear a comparable population. 72 hours, during which the plume would continue moving. Stay with me, because this is where it gets genuinely strange in ways that reach directly into the present. The political consequences for the Reagan administration would have been existential, not in the metaphorical sense that political commentators use loosely. Genuinely existential, as in, the Reagan presidency as we understand it in the historical record would almost certainly not have survived in its current form. Ronald Reagan had spent his first term making nuclear energy a rhetorical cornerstone of American energy independence. His 1983 energy policy explicitly positioned domestic nuclear power as the solution to oil dependency and Soviet energy leverage. A catastrophic failure of American nuclear infrastructure, especially one that produced visible, documented, multi-generational health consequences in an American population, would have detonated that rhetorical framework completely. The 1986 midterm elections were already going to be difficult for Republicans following Iran-Contra. Add a domestic nuclear catastrophe of Chernobyl scale, and the historical modeling, however imprecise, suggests a Democratic wave of a magnitude that hadn't been seen since 1974. And here's what the research actually shows. The downstream consequences of that political shift would not be confined to nuclear policy. Because Reagan's second term, as it actually unfolded, was the period in which his administration's negotiating posture with Mikhail Gorbachev began to shift toward genuine arms reduction dialogue. Scholars continue to debate the precise causal weight of different factors, but historian James Graham Wilson, in The Triumph of Improvisation, documents how the period from 1985 to 1987 represented a genuine and somewhat unexpected opening in Cold War negotiations that produced the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty of 1987. A politically weakened Reagan, consumed by domestic nuclear catastrophe, and the political fallout of a failed evacuation of millions of Americans, almost certainly enters those negotiations, if he enters them at all, from a position of fundamentally different domestic political vulnerability. And a different Reagan in those negotiations is a different endpoint for the entire trajectory of late Cold War diplomacy, which is, by the way, not a small thing. That's the architecture of the world you were born into, shifting beneath your feet. And just to be clear about the timescale here, the INF Treaty was signed in December 1987. The Berlin Wall fell in November 1989. The Soviet Union formally dissolved in December 1991. These events are separated by months and years, not decades, which means the contingency window, the window in which any single disruption could have cascaded into a fundamentally different sequence, was remarkably narrow. A domestic nuclear catastrophe in 1986 sits right at the hinge of that sequence, right at the moment when the trajectory of the entire Cold War's end was most sensitive to disruption. But let's go further. Because the environmental and public health consequences would have reshaped American domestic policy in ways that are even harder to fully trace and even more profound in their long-term implications. Look at what happened in Ukraine and Belarus after the actual Chernobyl disaster. The contaminated exclusion zone covers approximately 2,600 square kilometers, roughly the size of Rhode Island, and remains largely uninhabitable today, nearly 4 decades later. Thyroid cancer rates in children in the region increased by a factor of between 60 and 100, according to epidemiological data published in the British Medical Journal by researchers Dillner and colleagues in 1995. The economic cost of the disaster to the Soviet economy, factoring in cleanup, lost productivity, relocation, and long-term health care, has been estimated by economic historian Serhiy Plokhy in Chernobyl: History of a Tragedy at somewhere between $700 billion and $1 trillion in present-day equivalent value. Now place that economic and environmental catastrophe inside the American legal system. Here's the thing, and this is the part that genuinely unsettles me every time I think about it. The Soviet Union, whatever its failures, had the singular bureaucratic advantage of being able to suppress litigation, suppress epidemiological data, and suppress independent scientific research. The American system cannot do those things. Class action litigation against nuclear operators, against the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, against federal and state governments for failures of emergency response. The resulting legal cascade would have been the largest environmental tort in American history by an enormous margin. Estimates from legal scholars like Richard Lazarus, whose work on environmental law history at Harvard is authoritative, suggest that a comparable incident in a densely populated American region would have produced tort liability exceeding anything the American legal system had ever processed, including asbestos and tobacco litigation combined. And this matters not just as legal history. It matters because of what it would have done to American risk assessment, American infrastructure investment, and American technological culture in the decades that followed. The actual history of the late 1980s and 1990s in America is, among other things, a story of technological optimism. The early internet, the personal computer revolution, the growing cultural conviction that technological complexity was a source of power and progress rather than existential risk. A domestic nuclear catastrophe, documented in real time, producing generational health consequences in millions of Americans, would have fundamentally altered that cultural calculus, not eliminated technological development, but shifted its texture, made the American public and American regulatory institutions measurably more precautionary about large-scale technological systems in ways that would have filtered into how the internet was governed, how biotechnology was regulated, how AI research was approached decades later. If this is already making you rethink everything you assumed about how contingent the present actually is, subscribe, because we go this deep every single week. The history that built the world you live in is far stranger and far more fragile than anyone tells you in school. Back to the cascade. Because there's an international dimension that I haven't touched yet, and it changes the entire picture. The actual Chernobyl disaster, the one that really happened, played a direct and documented role in the collapse of Soviet legitimacy. Gorbachev himself wrote in his memoirs that Chernobyl was perhaps the real cause of the collapse of the Soviet Union. Historian Kate Brown, in Manual for Survival, draws on previously inaccessible Soviet archives to show how the disaster exposed the fundamental untenability of Soviet information control in a way that glasnost, Gorbachev's policy of openness, had not yet managed to. But here's the inversion that takes a moment to fully process. If the catastrophic nuclear disaster of 1986 had been American rather than Soviet, the propaganda value for the Soviet state would have been incalculable. Soviet state media, TASS, Pravda, would have broadcast footage of American evacuees, American contamination, American government dysfunction on every television in the Soviet bloc. The narrative of capitalist technological failure, of American government lying to its own people, would have been exactly the counter-narrative the Soviet system needed at precisely the moment it was most vulnerable to internal questions about its own legitimacy. Which means, and this is the part where the floor genuinely drops out, the specific sequence of events that eroded Soviet internal confidence and produced the opening for the Cold War's peaceful resolution may have depended, at least in part, on Chernobyl happening on the Soviet side of the ideological divide rather than the American side. Documented. This is not speculation. Gorbachev said it directly in his own words. The primary sources confirm it, and if the disaster lands on American soil instead, the Soviet Union enters the late 1980s with a propaganda advantage that could plausibly have extended its ideological coherence by years, which means the Berlin Wall doesn't fall in 1989, which means the Soviet Union doesn't dissolve in 1991 on the timeline it actually did, which means the world you were born into, every assumption you carry about the structure of international relations, the global economy, the technological architecture of the internet, the geography of NATO, is built on a foundation that, in this alternate timeline, simply doesn't exist. And somehow the implications get larger from here, not smaller. The long-term consequences for American nuclear policy would have foreclosed something that is only now, in 2026, beginning to re-emerge as a serious political possibility. The actual history of American nuclear power after 1986, shaped by Chernobyl's distant horror, produced a regulatory and political environment so hostile to new nuclear construction that not a single new commercial reactor came online in America between 1996 and 2016. That 20-year gap, in a period when climate science was establishing with increasing urgency that carbon emissions were reshaping the planet's atmosphere, is directly connected to the psychology of nuclear risk that Chernobyl implanted in the public imagination. Now imagine that same psychology, but amplified by 10, by 100, by the actual lived experience of American families in the evacuation zones, American children with elevated thyroid cancer rates, American towns with contaminated groundwater within driving distance of major cities. The political space for nuclear energy in any form, including the advanced, genuinely safer designs like small modular reactors now being developed by companies like NuScale and backed by the Department of Energy, would almost certainly have been permanently foreclosed in American political culture. And without American investment, research, and regulatory development in advanced nuclear technology, the global trajectory of that technology shifts fundamentally. Which is not a minor thing in a world where decarbonizing the electricity grid is one of the central civilizational challenges of the 21st century, right? Let's bring this to where it finally, completely lands. What the actual world required, the specific world you live in right now in 2026, with the international order it has, the technological infrastructure it runs on, the climate trajectory it's following, the nuclear arsenal agreements that constrain the worst possibilities, was a specific sequence of events in the 1980s. It required Chernobyl to happen in the Soviet Union, exposing Soviet institutional failure at the exact moment Gorbachev needed external pressure to justify internal reform. It required the Reagan administration to remain politically coherent enough to pursue arms reduction negotiations from a position of relative domestic stability. It required American nuclear anxiety to be the product of a foreign disaster rather than a domestic one, real enough to halt new construction, but not so viscerally immediate that it permanently poisoned the political ground for any future nuclear development whatsoever. It required the Cold War to end in the specific sequence and at the specific pace at which it actually ended, rather than being extended or destabilized by a propaganda reversal of historic proportions. None of that was inevitable, not one piece of it. The reactor in Pripyat could have held together for one more night. The test that destroyed it was delayed for 10 hours by a dispatcher who needed the power and was rescheduled to a night shift crew that hadn't been trained on the new protocol. 10 hours, one dispatcher. The difference between the world you know and a world in which the Cold War ends differently? American nuclear culture is permanently closed rather than cyclically cautious, and the entire trajectory of international relations in the 1990s runs through a different set of crises and resolutions. This is the part that gets me every single time I come back to the research. Not the horror of the alternate scenario, not even the strangeness of how close the divergence was. It's the specific texture of how ordinary and human the actual hinge was. A night shift crew, a delayed test, a design flaw that Soviet engineers knew about and had been quietly noting in internal memos since 1983, as historian Plocke documents from the archives. The present moment you inhabit was not the result of grand historical forces moving with inevitable momentum toward a predetermined conclusion. It was the result of that dispatcher making that call, of that crew being the one on duty at 1:23 in the morning, of the wind blowing northwest instead of south. The world is not inevitable. It never was. It is a specific chain of decisions, accidents, and contingencies. And almost any of them could have gone differently in ways that would have made the world you know simply unrecognizable. That is not a comfortable thought, but it is, I think, the most honest and the most important thing the historical record has to tell us. Before we close this out, drop a comment and tell me which part of this changed how you think about the relationship between nuclear history and the world we actually live in. I read them, and I'll see you in the next one.